One of the most important pieces before we diversify is to make sure that we stabilize. So I always want to start there. Anytime we're preparing for a pivot, when folks try to pivot, oftentimes we forget that we still have to maintain the thing that's actually maintaining our income, right? And so keeping the practice visible, making sure that we know our numbers so that when we actually begin to expand or scale that business to add another stream of income, that we don't do the thing that I like to call a stream of struggle, that because we've diluted or diverted our attention, we often don't think about the importance of having to kind of create a new marketing strategy for that new line of service that people may not already know that we do.
This episode is sponsored by TherapyNotes, therapynotes.com. Be sure and check them out and be sure and use the promo code Gordon, Gordon, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. Over 15 years ago, when I started my private practice, I had to learn a lot, and most of it the hard way, and I don't think you need to do the same. Hi, I'm Gordon Brewer, a licensed psychotherapist, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast, part of the Psychcraft network of podcasts. Join me in this journey of discovery as we have conversations with other leaders and professionals in both the mental and allied health fields. Join us as we explore both the business and clinical sides of running a private practice. Hello, friends. Welcome to the podcast. This is Gordon Brewer, and this is episode number 367 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. So, glad you've joined me. Hope you're having a good start to your year as this episode's coming out this last week of January. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it seems like the months just go by faster here lately. But anyway, I don't know about you as well. I'm ready for some warm weather. It's been really cold here in Tennessee and we've had a long streak of just colder than usual weather. So anyway, not to get too far down the rabbit trail talking about the weather, but anyway, I'm looking forward to you hearing from my guest today, Dr. Ajita Robinson. And she was just such a delightful person to speak with and really has just a lot of insight into our practices and in particular ways in which we can diversify our income. I think a lot of times when we're going into private practice, particularly solo practitioners, and the people, and even in group practices, the people that work for us, you can kind of hit a ceiling with the income potential. And so a lot of times it's important to think about, okay, how can I diversify my income through other things, using my knowledge about other things. And Ajita wrote a book called The Gift of Grief, and in it she just talks about her own grief journey and really just drawing from her experience as a therapist as well. So anyway, we dive into this, and I'm really looking forward to you hearing my conversation with her. Like I said, she was just such a delightful person to get to know, and I'm hoping to have some more conversations with her in the future. But real quickly, before we get to my conversation with Dr. Robinson, I'd love for you to check out the Practice of Therapy Collaborative. The doors are open again until February the 14th. And the Practice of Therapy Collaborative is a membership community that meets each week, and I facilitate that. And it's really a professional support group, if you will, to some degree. But as much as anything, it's a way for you to build community and learn from other people that are in private practice. As I mentioned, we meet once a week. We have different topics each time we meet, but a lot of times we'll do a hot seat and have kind of a mastermind kind of format. Other times I might present a particular topic that I can do some teaching with, and then also have some discussions around that. And then also we have some guest consultants that join us periodically to talk about different aspects of private practice. But if you are looking for some support in your practice this year and really wanting to learn from others and learn from other experts in the field, this is a really great way to do it. If you'll go over to practiceoftherapy.com/practice collaborative, you can find the landing page there for that. And if you sign up now, between now and February the 14th, you can get $15 off the monthly membership for that. And if you're curious about whether it's a good fit for you or not, you'll see on that page a link to where you can schedule a little 15-minute chat with me for us to talk about it and see if it is going to be a good fit for you. So be sure and check it out, the Practice of Therapy Collaborative, and you can go to practiceoftherapy.com/practice collaborative. And you can find out more about that there. And also, real quickly, before we get to my conversation with Dr. Ajita Robinson, if you will go over and check out mentalhealthwaretn.com. I'm still helping my friend Ashley get her store up and going, and she is just coming up with more and more new designs around mental health and addiction recovery. And so be sure and check it out. She's also got a lot of great stuff for us professionals. So if you're looking for the perfect LMFT t-shirt or LCSW t-shirt or LPC t-shirt, she's got them there, and she can customize really anything that you find there. So be sure and check it out, mentalhealthwaretn.com. And also, real quickly here before we get to my conversation with Dr. Robinson, love for you to hear from one of our members of the Psychcraft Network, along with a word from our sponsor of the podcast, TherapyNotes.
Hey there, I'm Chris McDonald, and if you don't know me yet, I'm host of Yoga in the Therapy Room podcast. Have you been interested in bringing the body into therapy in a trauma-informed way? This podcast is for you. This podcast helps empower non-traditional mental health therapists with the knowledge and confidence to integrate yoga into their sessions safely and ethically. Yoga in the Therapy Room is proudly part of the Psychcraft Podcast Network, a network of podcasts focused on helping people live more meaningful and productive lives. Join me each week as we explore practical techniques, discuss the latest research, yoga philosophies, and share expert insights to help you seamlessly blend yoga with traditional therapy methods. If you haven't listened yet, you can find it over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Ready to upgrade your practice from a rusty bicycle to a shiny new sports car? Buckle up, because TherapyNotes is here to turbocharge your journey. It's the comprehensive practice management system you've been craving, equipped with everything you need to navigate patient records, schedule seamlessly, host remote sessions, craft detailed notes, and tackle insurance billing with ease. And guess what? It's your trusty sidekick, available whenever and wherever duty calls. Picture having more quality time with your clients, all thanks to this digital assistant that never clocks out. Here's the kicker. It's Gordon approved, so you can trust it's the real deal. Bid farewell to paperwork headaches and embrace a new era of efficiency and top-tier care. Ready to level up your private practice game? Swing by practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes and punch in promo code GORDON for 2 months on the house. Enjoy the show.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the podcast. And I'm really happy for you to get to know Dr. Ajita Robinson. And Ajita, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Gordon.
Yes, and Ajita has a large group practice up in Maryland. And today we're going to be talking about just the ways that things are changing in our industry or in our professions, and also ways of thinking about diversifying our income. And so, Jetta, as I start with everyone, tell folks a little more about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed.
Yes. So I started my career in corporate America, working for some names y'all might recognize, Nestle, Pfizer, Walmart, and really doing a lot of business and revenue strategy. So helping those underperforming divisions make more money, essentially, would come and revitalize that process. But there was a disconnect for me. I was selling, in some cases, pet food or, widgets, things of that nature, and really felt a gap in purpose, which led me to mental health. And I should have known because both of my parents have worked in mental health my entire life, that would come full circle. And so, I went on to pursue my doctorate. I was a full-time professor training students. And then I opened my practice 12 years ago, actually.
Wow.
And I knew that I wanted a training center. But what I kept encountering was that clinicians would hit a wall either on direct practice because life was lifing. And most clinicians that I know work two jobs. And I began looking at ways to really kind of protect my clinicians so that they could stay in this field longer and leveraging how do we continue to increase their income without having to increase their caseload, which for us led us to securing contracts with the county and our eventually federal government and other opportunities that allowed my clinicians to use their skill sets. Not only to kind of impact lives, but also to stabilize their income. And so that brought my corporate revenue strategy, my mental health background kind of merged them. And so now part of what I do in addition to leading my practice is I help mental health professionals launch and scale their businesses and leverage their clinical skills beyond direct practice. And so that's that full circle moment, right?
Yeah. So that is really fascinating. I know in the consulting world and the work that I do with just talking with private practice owners or people wanting to go into private practice, that's a question that always comes up because you're correct. Eventually, people will hit a ceiling with their earning potential. And the best way that I know around that is to look at the ways in which we can diversify our income. So let us spill us your wisdom, Jetta. What have you learned about that, and what sort of strategies do you think people should take?
Absolutely. I think one of the most important pieces before we diversify is to make sure that we stabilize. So I always want to start there anytime we're preparing for a pivot, because what I find and I'm sure you have encountered this, that when folks try to pivot, oftentimes we forget that we still have to maintain the thing that's actually maintaining our income, right? And so keeping the practice visible, making sure that we know our numbers so that when we actually begin to expand or scale that business to add another stream of income, that we don't do the thing that I like to call a stream of struggle, that because we've diluted or diverted our attention, we often don't think about the importance of having to kind of create a new marketing strategy for that new line of service that people may not already know that we do, right? I'm a grief and trauma therapist. It makes sense that the bulk of my speaking is in the area of grief and trauma. But I did have to reintroduce myself because the way that I talk to and serve direct clients is different than the way that corporations and universities and hospitals make decisions. And so I needed different infrastructure, different branding, and different messages around being able to make that line of service profitable. And so getting, I think, very clear about who we serve and how we do that work. And more importantly, I think, is recognizing that corporations and organizations make decisions using different points of interest or different deciding factors than a direct practice client might, and making sure that we're actually speaking the language of the decision maker and what they actually need from us, right? And I think we spend so much time being focused on clients that we often aren't sure how to switch and talk to another CEO, right? Which I often remind clinicians of, like, we give up our power and expertise because they may be a CEO or VP at a Fortune 500 company. Well, you're also a CEO with lived experience and expertise. And so you're speaking to a colleague. And so I really think that kind of brand clarity and then being clear about who our avatar is that would best benefit from those services is really important to do.
Yes. And you had said something kind of in our introduction just about reaching out to like federal and state agencies tell us more about that as far as those kinds of opportunities that maybe people aren't aware of.
Absolutely. So, one of the, I think, cool ways to kind of scale your business, and I always say that when it comes to like state, local, and federal contracts, you need to have cash reserves in place because most of those contracts have a 45 to 60 day payable term, which means you'll get paid 45 to 60 days after delivering a service or after invoicing. And so you need to have enough cash reserve to be able to, pay your team, right? When I started off, I staffed myself on those contracts. And so I could delay paying myself, which isn't ideal, but it's much more sustainable than not paying your team when you're just starting out. And so those are some that's just one thing that I wish I knew going in, I think with more clarity, right? But getting started really was a matter of registering with my state. And I started with local and state contracts. I think those are easier to navigate than federal contracts if you're just beginning. And so think about that. All of us are our license is governed under the Department of Health and Human Services or whatever it's called in your state. And they provide and pay for services for people who need mental health services, who have court required services or mandated care. That falls under Department of HHS in most states. And so it was easier to get into there. And so what we basically did was register as a vendor with our state and then register as a vendor with our county. And this was a matter of it was very similar to registering my business with my state, right? There's some documentation. You need to build your profile so that other agencies know how to work with you, other vendors know how to work with you. And then I began going to procurement events. Procurement is essentially the purchasing department for your state or university and the federal government. And so they often have matching events where they're looking for people who provide a specific service. And so I always sign up for those. I go to at least still 12 years later, I go to at least 1 to 2 a month because that's where a lot of these conversations are happening, where you can meet decision makers who are looking for folks. And one of the things that I think is a gift that we have is that every single person that you meet either needs mental health services or knows someone who does. And so it doesn't matter what room we're in. If we are clear about how we serve, it makes it, I think, much easier for us to walk into spaces and build partnerships and relationships. And that has worked really, really well as a strategy for us. And then the other piece that gives us an added advantage anytime we're competing for contracts is we have business certifications. And so there's 5 main ones that are recognized at both the federal and the state level: veteran-owned businesses, disabled business owners, women-owned businesses, minority businesses, and disadvantaged business owners. Those contracts are what they call set aside. And so it's literally money in contracts that are set aside for businesses that meet the criteria for those certifications. And there's billions of dollars that get unallocated because not enough of us know and not enough of us apply. And so those were ways that I got into contracting. And now we get approached to partner because we have these criteria and we have a good track record of delivering mental health services. And I always want to kind of remind people that it's not just mental health services. Our largest contract with the federal government was for training. We didn't do any direct service. Wow. And so that was our largest contract that we received, was to train 300 federal law enforcement officers in mental health first aid. And so it doesn't have to be service. The government buys books, they buy training, they buy consultation, they buy t-shirts, right? And so there's so many ways that we can sell and serve local, state, and federal contracts in that regard.
Yeah. That is really fascinating because I think, the opportunity to do trainings is probably much more prevalent than we realize. Just like you mentioned, the mental health first aid. I know the other place that might be, I don't know if you've had any dealings with this, but also churches and things like that, where they need somebody to come in and do the training.
Absolutely. And universities and hospitals are big areas, right? Our K through 12, our schools in general, K through 12 or higher ed, have recurring contract. And what I think is pretty cool is when it's kind of one of those things that once you know, and I always love kind of spilling little tips that people may not be aware of, but that are readily available and that are free, is that if the school is publicly funded, their budgets are also public information. And so that can help you with identifying who has the funding. And in their annual reporting where they're requesting money, they're earmarking money for professional development if they're K through 12. And in many of these schools, there's state and federal laws that have mandates around what type of training educators and staff must maintain. Most states have a training that says every year educators and members serving in a K through 12 school, as well as universities that receive federal funding or public dollars, have to have some training around suicide prevention and intervention. And so those are ones that they're required to do. And who else is better trained to support educators with being able to recognize that? During the pandemic, we did over 100 trainings to schools to show them how to recognize mental health distress in an online classroom, because most of our educators had never taught virtually. And we knew that our educators are on the front line of being able to recognize child abuse and neglect. And if they're not in the classroom, how else do we kind of get eyes on our kids if they're in a virtual setting? How do we recognize when kids are struggling from a social emotional perspective? And our educators needed those skills because they were being put in situations that nothing prepared them for, on top of everything that the pandemic created, right? And so we always identify what's the gap that's happening in our community where we can serve, because people will, if it's a priority for them that's causing them pain and it's a known problem, they will partner with you if you can offer the solution. And so that's what we did to support our local schools that we knew were struggling, right, with how to kind of adapt a curriculum to an online setting. And then we have some clinicians that are trained in working with individuals with neurodiversity and neurodiverse learning needs. And so that was an additional training that we were able to offer, was how to kind of create that inclusive learning space in online classroom. And so that's just one idea how we were able to be responsive to a critical need that schools didn't even recognize was going to be a problem, but we knew would affect our kids because it's our area of specialization, right?
Yeah. That is so cool. What are some other areas in which we might be missing out on diversifying our incomes that maybe don't come to mind for people?
Yes, one of my favorite is, I think that all therapists should have a book of some sort. And part of the reason this is because we're outnumbered, and we're going to be outnumbered for a really long time. And I think a book or some other self-help avenue is one way that we can get people access to what happens in those one-on-one sessions or in our group sessions, because there aren't enough of us to serve the amount of people that actually need access. And so that's one way. And people are still interested in self-help. It's a $14 billion industry, and not enough of us who are trained to support people who are navigating grief and trauma and anxiety and, reparenting are contributing to that body of knowledge. And so there's a lot of information out there that's unfortunately causing more harm. And so I think mental health clinicians have an opportunity, and in some regards, we have a responsibility to disrupt what's happening in the self-help space to make sure people get access who otherwise aren't coming to therapy. There's some people who are not coming to therapy, regardless of the fact that they have access, but they are still looking for resources to help them better understand what's happening for them, to better advocate, to better cope. And I think that's one way that we can contribute while also generating income for ourselves. I have two of my books behind me that have sold internationally. And I can't tell you how many people have reached out to me to say, oh my goodness, this really helped me understand and be a better companion to someone that was grieving, because I didn't realize that I held these false beliefs about grief that really affected myself and certainly affected how I was supporting my spouse or my kid or my employee, right? And I think that's one way. And I also think that speaking is another way that we can, one, free up some of our time, but also impact more people. I got to train an audience of 2,000 in 90 minutes, right? I got access to 2,000 people to have an impact that walked away with strategies. How long would it take me to touch that number of people, to give them psychoeducation, to give them coping skills if I kept doing one-on-one or smaller engagements? And that work is totally worthwhile. It's just not sustainable long-term, especially with the amount of, I think, vicarious trauma that we're experiencing as clinicians, the burnout we're experiencing that are causing us to exit the field at alarming rates. I think being able to do speaking and consulting allows us to have a larger impact in a compressed amount of time, right? And so I think that's something that those are things that we can bring that
Yes.
add tremendous value to communities and workplaces.
Yeah, yeah. And you hit on something that is just really, I think, a key point in just thinking about diversifying income. It's moving from the one-to-one kind of way of providing things to the one-to-many. And I think that if we can kind of get our heads around that and think about ways in which we can go get to that and the different avenues in which we are, things we're passionate about, things that we have our expertise in, that sort of thing. I'll have to admit, Ajita, is that you have kind of prompted me to revisit. I was also going to be planning on doing a memoir or a book about grief, which is similar to what you've done, but from the perspective of a therapist who has also lost their wife. And so being able to, do something like that. It's been an idea that's been back there for the past year, but yeah. And so I think that's an important thing to think about our own life's experiences and how we've applied them in our own life. I think it's just the perfect kind of self-help book.
Absolutely. And it's a wonderful way to honor ourselves in this work. I wrote my book, The Gift of Grief, in probably one of the hardest seasons of my life, and didn't feel qualified, didn't feel ready, but was also maxed out. And I kept getting, other clinicians that would ask like, hey, can you train this? And there's only so many clinicians that I can supervise, right? And most of us don't get experience in our courses and in our programs on grief. And all of us are doing grief work. Some of us just without the knowledge and the skills that we need, but all of us are doing grief work if we're working with people. And so that is really what compelled me to continue and move forward. I did eventually expand it to a 16-week curriculum where I do actually train other clinicians, and an 8-hour component of that where I go and I train HR leaders. And so I brought that up because oftentimes we think we have to continue creating new things or different things. And I created 7 variations of that thing, right? It's a course, it's a training, right? It's a series. It's a 16-week program to train clinicians, an 8-hour curriculum, right? To train non-clinicians. It's the title of my TED Talk, right? And I think that allows us to really understand that we can serve well and long. And for me, deep, I don't want to kind of do all of the things and be scattered and burnt out in that way, because you can easily trade direct practice for speaking, and then that becomes a direct practice pipeline there, right? Every time I speak, someone walks up to me and asks, can I work with you? And it's like, I don't have additional spaces for clients. I'm glad I have a team, but the piece that I think is so important is that that's a thing that can outlive us in perpetuity, right? Think about the books that we have read as we become clinicians. Many of those authors are no longer walking this earth, and yet they're still having such an impact. And for me, that's a living legacy that I get to benefit from. It brings me great joy when people are like, thank you so much. And they're talking about my book, and I was scared to death. And I was like, is it enough? And I agonized over it for like 18 months before I put it into the world. And literally, it has sold on every single continent. And that wouldn't that have happened if I just didn't get out of the way? Now, I keep tweaking it, right? And I'm, have revised it, and there's a second edition coming out. But I remind myself, like, how many editions of, counseling theory did I, like, it's on the 16th edition, and no one's saying, oh, it wasn't a good book.
All right.
We can edit, modify it for the rest of our life. But what is at stake if we don't make it available to the people who truly need it, if we keep it wrapped up in ourselves or in those individual sessions, and people are truly suffering? And so that is what prompted me to get out of my way. And I dedicated it to my grandfather, who did not live to see the book come to life. And that was one way that I was able to honor him, but also honor my recommitment to doing this work, because I was disconnected from it at that season of my life. And it gave me renewed purpose, right? It gave me just renewed energy that I could do this work differently in a way that didn't require self-abandonment. And I think that's an important part of what diversification allows. It allows us to continue to serve the people that may not have access, right? It creates additional breathing room in my practice where we can pro bono sessions. We can accept clients whether they have the capacity to pay because we have been able to create such a profit center through passive income and diversified income that I can fund our pro bono sessions and still pay my clinicians. And that, again, wouldn't be possible if I didn't recognize that my number one responsibility as a CEO is to make money so that we're in the community for 12 plus years, right? Because if we don't have financial stability, I can't pay my team. Our doors close, right? And that those two wanting to be profitable and do purposeful work, that they align with one another. They're not in conflict when the intention is service, right? To others and to self. So that's for me, the exciting part of being clear about how else we can do this work that also takes care of us, right?
That's you talk about so many important things, Ajita, and I'm curious. You mentioned getting out of your own way. So how did you do that? Because first thing that comes to mind for me is just thinking about imposter syndrome, and which I think a lot of us maybe suffer from that. What was kind of the turning point for you?
I think the turning point for me actually happened when my grandfather died. And unfortunately, 9 months later, my oldest brother died. And my oldest brother's death was very public, and I unofficially became our family's PR person. And it really was my training and background in grief and crisis that allowed me to function during such a terrible time in my life. And I found myself correcting mistruths and then helping not only my family, but my brother's children and my extended family navigate what they couldn't process, they couldn't name. And because there was a very public nature to my brother's death, I found myself educating people who were impacted because of the way the news covered his death. And answering questions over and over again that I think I had taken for granted because it's the language I speak every day. And one of the final things that my grandfather said to me before he died was that you've done enough. And really what that meant was I'm a first generation poverty and trauma disruptor. I'm the first and only doctor in any generation of my family. And I didn't realize the ways that I was constantly trying to repay my family of origin for all the sacrifices they made so that I could be in ways that actually was stifling my creativity, my growth, my career even. And he really freed me up from that. And that was literally one of the final things that he said to me. And then my brother dying as a result of suicide and being a mental health clinician and not being able to help him, I knew that alone could help other people. And so it really wasn't me. It was this innate sense of responsibility to helping other people that allowed me to tell a part of my story on my terms that other folks could relate to. And I think sometimes as therapists, people think that we're immune, and me being very vulnerable and as transparent as I was comfortable with being, navigating those things publicly allowed me to normalize what grief looked like across time, even when you're high functioning and, you're successful, that none of those things buffer you from experiencing the fullness of grief, including the joy. Because my grandfather was no longer suffering from cancer. My brother was no longer suffering. And as a mental health clinician, he didn't meet the criteria. He didn't have the initial signs. And that allowed me to also help educate others about what this actually looks like, right?
Yeah.
And someone that was very successful and, and happy and all the things that we think make someone protected and buffered against something like that, right? And so it wasn't me. It really was my faith and my recommitment to making sure that I did right by them in this part of my life, right?
Yes.
So I think that's what kind of forced me to fear couldn't drive the car anymore because there was too much at stake. And it doesn't have to be death, but death is a wake-up call for so many of us that reorients us to how we're actually living. And what I didn't recognize was that career and my identity as a wife at the time and a mom had taken up so much space that I had stopped being Ajita. And on the other side of grief and loss is a renewed gift around how we operate in the future. And that's really what this book is anchored around.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to get my hands on it. And Jetta, I've got to be respectful of your time. And this has been such a wonderful conversation. Tell folks how they can get in touch with you, find out more about your book and your TED Talk and all of those great things.
Absolutely. So since I have such a unique name, you can find me at ajitarobinson.com. I'm Ajita Robinson on all platforms, on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. And on my website, there's a tab called Shop where you can find both of my books. And my Instagram has a ton of free resources for therapists. If you're thinking about diversifying, there's a 30 Ways to Diversify workbook that has some questions to help you get clear, as well as some ideas about how you can diversify. And so connect with me on social media. I'd love to serve.
Awesome. So, well, Dr. Ajita Robinson, I'm so glad that we got to meet, and hopefully we'll have another conversation. Well, a big thanks to Dr. Ajita Robinson for joining me. She is such an amazing person, and I learned so much from her and just really was inspired by our conversation. If you'll go over to ajitarobinson.com, and there'll be a link here in the show notes and the show summary, you can find out all about all of her great resources. She's got a 30 Ways to Diversify Your Income workbook, which I'm looking forward to getting my hands on that as well. And she's got just a ton of great resources on her website. But one of the things that, as many of you that have been listening to the podcast for a while maybe know that, grief can really have a profound effect on us, and particularly in our practices and trying to manage things. As many of you know, last year in 2023, I lost my wife, and she had a long battle with breast cancer and a brain tumor and all that went with that. And so this past year has been, as I like to say, me finding the new normal. And, our loss is something that, I think we need to not confront, but just deal with, openly and being vulnerable with people, and also reaching out to the support of others. I know that is the only way I've been able to make it through, is through the support of just close friends and colleagues and people like you out there that have just been so kind to me along the way. But so I really admire Ajita for the work she's doing, and she's really kind of inspired me to think about maybe creating my book. It's been brewing in the back of my head for some time now, but anyway, be sure and check her out. And also, big thanks to our sponsor of the podcast, TherapyNotes. You can find out more about them by going to practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. They are the leading electronic health record system for mental health providers. As you've heard from me before, they're who I use in my practice, and I'm constantly impressed with all the things that they're doing to improve that platform. And it's really, when you look at what they provide on the platform, it is well worth the investment. And that at least from what I hear from other colleagues and just comparing apples to apples, their platform is really one of the best out there. So be sure and check it out, and be sure and use that promo code Gordon, just GORDON, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. So be sure and check it out. And also check out my friend Ashley's store, mentalhealthwaretn.com. And she's got lots of great stuff there. And if you purchase more than $50 worth of stuff, you can get free shipping. So that's a pretty neat deal there for a lot of people. So be sure and check it out. And also, big thanks for joining us. Be sure to take time to follow us or subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it. Got lots of great guests lined up here for our next few episodes. So take care, folks, and we'll be back with you again next week for another episode. You've been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts. You can find out more about the other great podcasts in the network by visiting psychcraftnetwork.com. And if you haven't done so already, please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com and get your free private practice startup guide, along with a lot of other great resources and webinars and free things just by visiting. Also, be sure to follow us wherever you might be listening to your podcasts. This podcast is intended to be educational in purpose and is not intended to give legal, accounting, or counseling advice. If you need a professional, find the right person for that.